Queer history is a bit fragmented when you try to search it up in a city, in a urban structure. So it's kind of difficult to create a route where you get a perfect chronological order. So I'm sorry to say we have to jump a bit back and forth in time to be able to get to be able to catch it all in a proper way. So I think that without actually saying so much here, I think we'll just start with the 1880s, and that is in the alley just behind the pharmacy over there. So you can just follow me and we'll take it from there. Okay, first stop, ladies and gentlemen. We're gonna move to the end of the 19th century now, more specific to the 1880s. At that time, this little alley here had a different name than it has today. Today it's called Sommerveita, or Summer Alley, you could call it. And that's nothing to do with the season summer. It has to do with the family Sommer who built the building over there, which is the old Swan Pharmacy. They were one of the richest people in the city in the end of the 18th century. But until the 1880s, from the end of the 18th century and up to the 1880s, this lane was called Hell's Lane, or Helvetesveita. That was the name of this place. Now, the reason why they changed the name was because this little society moved in the 1880s, and it was a bit difficult for them to have that type of address. So, due to that, the alley changed name to Sommerveita, but in common tongue, this was Helvetesveita all the way up to the 1930s, and then you could say that word kind of moved out of the common vocabulary. But the name the alley got from a tavern that was placed in here called Helvete, or Hell. That was the nickname of the tavern. And this specific tavern had a bit of an odd reputation, and was one of the reasons why the Mission Society actually moved heavily into this particular lane, because this tavern had a reputation for being quite sinful, and not common sinful, but you can call it a bit queer sinful. One of the first functions of the Mission Society in here from the 1880s was to establish a station for what in Norwegian is called falne gutter. You had many houses for so-called fallen women, right? But you had none officially for fallen boys. This was men who had been scandalized, or what was the more common description of it, young men who had been misled by the bad lusts of older men. That was the description of those who they were trying to save, and they had a specific concentration in this particular tavern that had given this alley its name. Now, we don't really have a lot of descriptions or details on how these things that was in this alley came about, if it was a sort of a brothel of some kind, or if it was just kind of a turnout point where you could hook up with people. But I mean, this was a city full of sailors, so you had many taverns around the city that had a reputation like this, but nothing as big as this particular one. And I mean, nothing as big as that actually leading for the establishment of the Mission Society in this particular place, because they thought they needed to do something here to strict up morale. I mean, the end of the 19th century is perhaps one of the most difficult periods, I would say, for gays and lesbians, because the legal system started to get an interest in details that they earlier hadn't had. You have the new Victorian laws that came in England that spread throughout the British colonies, and of course this new type of mood when it came to what was proper and what wasn't proper, and the church and the state's duty to really go into all the depths of society to kind of lift it up to a proper state was really intensified in this particular period. And of course the Mission Society was one of the instruments that the church, and through the church the state, actually used to kind of get this job done. You can also see in exactly the same time the whole legal system is changed. We got a new law in 1902 that was a lot more detailed than any earlier law when it came to which type of crimes that was punishable. And we also had the first debate, which we're going to talk about later, on criminalizing sexual activities between women, which didn't happen because, well, the members of parliament, at least the minister of law, didn't think that it was possible for women to actually encounter in sexual activities. But this all has to do with the same time, you can say. What I think we're going to do now is that we're going to move from here and a little bit closer in time. We're going to go to the 1930s. We're going to follow the main street, Munkegata, through. We're going to go through the park over here, and we're going to go down to a place called Ravnkloa, which used to be the old fish market, where there was two specific hookup places, one for the privileged and one for the non-privileged. And we're going to take it from there when we come down there. Ja, tar det bare her. I think we'll take it from here so we don't have to cross so many streets. The problem with trying to find gay history in a city is that at least up to the modern times, it's very, very fragmented. Extremely fragmented. So you're lucky if you kind of hit, and especially if you hit something, it's probably a criminal offense. Well, we have some good stories, which we're going to look at later, from the 18th century, but it's from the 1930s and up to our times that we have more detailed sources, because we have people that either are alive or have been interviewed recently, who are now dead, that actually had experienced this and told about it. And the gay scene in Trondheim in the 1930s was, to a certain extent, divided in between a public toilet down on the fish market down there, which was a non-exclusive scene, you could say, for everyone who wanted to come. And that was actually quite a big cruising spot in the city, all the way up to, help me, 1980s? Yeah. But in the 30s, 40s and 50s, there was a kind of a class division between those who had to go down there and those who could show up in one of the apartments in this pink building on the corner here, because on the top lived a flower decorator who had not an open house at all, because I mean this was still a bit hush-hush, but still a place that was opened especially on Saturdays for those who were invited. So anyone could go in there, but you had to know someone, and someone had to, you could say, verify your good character and good name to enter this apartment up there. Now, I don't know the name of this person. I just know that his nickname was Auntie or Tante. Maybe some of you know what his name actually was? No. But he was a flower decorator. Everybody called him Auntie, and he opened his house for people we don't know who are. We don't have their names. We just know that it went on up there from the 1930s and up to the 50s. We have one episode down here from the war which should be mentioned, because Kim Friele, who all of you probably know, at least most of you, she wanted to erect a monument for gays who died in the Holocaust some years ago, some decades ago. It was a big project for her. The problem was that no Norwegians had died in German concentration camps or had been arrested, as far as we know at least. But there was one that was found in some sources, and that was someone who was arrested down there in the public toilet in Ravnkloa in 1942. But the problem was, this was a German soldier, and the problem was that he also turned out to be a British spy. And he died in a concentration camp after that. So it's a bit difficult to say what actually put him in there. Was it because he was arrested down there with his bridges down together with a man in one of the stalls, or was it because he was a British spy? But that's kind of the closest we get to have a victim, but it's not even our victim. It was part of the occupying force, so that's a bit difficult. That's what we find, at least. Now I think we're going to go from here, and next up we're going to move to the 1960s, a new safe house just up the street here. Now I'm approaching a bit thin ice, because now I think I'm going to talk about something that maybe some who are here actually have experienced. But that is our second safe house location, which is the second floor up here, which was in the 1960s owned or rented by an architect. I think he was a tutor in architecture in the now university.
He was an interior architect.
Interior architect, yeah. And this is what I have been told by people who were there in the 1960s, because this was also an apartment that was open for invited people on particular Saturdays. And for those who were newcomers, this is what I've been told, there was a bit of a ritual to get in. Because, first of all, one way of doing it was to show up in the restaurant or the bar Astoria, and if someone approached you by the bar and asked you if you had a nice evening, you were to say no. And if you said no, then a guy might the other person would say, well, maybe Nils would help you with that, and they would leave. And this was kind of this is very mysterious, and I don't know if it's even true, but this is what an old waiter who used to work in the city here actually had told me. He's dead now. But so you said you had a bad evening. He responded, Nils might help you with that. And then you got the code name, because then you were supposed to go here, call the doorbell. Someone would stick their head out of the window and said, who are you looking for? And if you said Nils, then they would come down and open the door for you. That was not the name of the person who owned the apartment. That was just, a bit of the charanderie around, how to get in and how to know that people came with good intentions, etc. But you've actually been here in the 1960s, both of you, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was quite another procedure, because we were standing in the street in Nordregate,
yeah,
and just whistling, and then the window was opened, and there was the key came out with a parachute, with a handkerchief parachute, and the entrance was definitely not here in the alley.
No,
it was from the main street.
Okay.
Definitely. So this is, but perhaps what you've heard is what happened in the beginning,
yeah,
and then the rules or was loosened up a bit.
This is Loffa's story.
Yeah.
He was a renowned waiter here in Trondheim for many years. But and when you were here, this was in the early 70s, or
70s, yes.
Yeah. And how many people could be here on a Saturday, at most? 20? Yeah. Good.
And of course, most people knew each other.
Yeah.
In one way or another, didn't they? Yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if of course, if a fresh fruit came along, everyone was very hungry.
Then I think we'll move further on, and then we're gonna. The next stop is actually a bit of a historic site. The Queer Archive has just presented a new article. I don't know if it's new even, but I hadn't read it before now, about the first establishment of gay organization in Norway, which is also just around the corner here. So that's going to be our next stop. But you had some extra.
But this was his second residence.
Aha.
You know that, because it started at Bakklandet,
Yeah.
near the old bridge.
Yeah.
In one of the warehouses. He had a flat there.
Okay.
That was, I think his first residence, which is also open.
Yeah.
That was one of the warehouses on the upper side of the bridge.
Yeah.
And more discreet.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. We'll carry on. So thanks to the Queer Archive, we now actually have a public article on the earliest gay organization history in Norway, which started here. Not in this building though, because the building where it all began has burnt down, and this replaced it after a fire in the 1960s. But this used to be the Seamen's Hotel, or the Sailors' Hotel. And as you probably know, the first gay organization in Scandinavia was founded in Denmark in 1948. The what is it called, also the Danske Forbund of 1948 or the Danish Society of 1948. The year after, a delegation from Trondheim went to Copenhagen and attended a meeting with this new organization and went back to Trondheim and founded a Trondheim branch in 1949. And they rented rooms in the second floor of the Sailors Hotel, and for around 6 months at least, they had that as a place to hang out for people. And the interesting thing about this article and the interview is that this was done with a person who attended this and was a part of the establishment. And what he said in this interview was that they were not secret about anything. The people in the Sailors Hotel knew exactly who they were and what they were doing and what kind of organization they had. They didn't even have a cover name on the organization. They were the Trondheim Society of 1948, and when they asked what that meant, they told them. And they still were allowed to rent rooms for their parties. So that is something that is very interesting to kind of excavate further, dig even deeper into. What does that mean, that this was totally unproblematic? Or we don't know if it was that, but at least they weren't kicked out when they told the runners of the Sailors Hotel what they were doing. But then, after a while, this what do you call it, event business or whatever, kind of broke down. Some people moved out of Trondheim, most of them moved to Oslo, and we didn't actually get a new established gay organization in the city until 1970. But interestingly enough, in 1973, the Society of 1948's Trondheim branch rented the basement of this particular hotel once again for their parties and meetings. So this was actually the first public, you could say, place to hang out for gays and lesbians in Trondheim after the decriminalization of 1972. So it has quite a long history, this spot, if not this building. This building has the newest history, and it was a building there that has the oldest history, not just for the city, but actually also for the country, which deserves even some extra digging.
I think that happened in Trondheim. Like, why here as opposed to...
I think coincidences. Yeah. These people going to Copenhagen, attending this meeting and going back here and knowing out from their own social circles that this was a need. I mean, this was something that people would appreciate if they did something about it, I think. Most things like it has to do with individual taking initiatives and not necessarily the climate of... But clearly it was a climate in the Sailors Hotel that wasn't all that bad. I mean, you can understand, it was a Sailors Hotel. So, I mean, they were known with... well, again, that's for the Queer Archive to try to dig a little deeper into. I think it's a funny extra story with this building here. What we're going to do now is that we're going to go to 2 blocks up, and we're going to have a stop by the location, you can say, in between 1950 and 1973, which is a building just up on the corner here. So you can just follow me. We took a little detour now, and the reason for that is because, I mean, we have so few sources on women, and the one I'm going to present to you now can just kind of slightly be called a source, but since it's more or less the only thing we got, we have to mention it. It used to stand a wooden building on the corner over here, which was torn down quite a few years ago. Now, actually, I don't know if that is even that was the right house, because I think that was built up after a city fire in the 1840s. But now we're going to go back to the end of the 18th century, to the 1790s. Because in the 1790s, it also was a big wooden building standing on the corner over there. And that was owned by a family called Holton Mom. They were very wealthy. They owned a big manor house in a place where at least 3 of us standing here are from, a place called Ørlandet. They were the owners of the manor of Austrot. And they were, you could say, privileged gentry of the time. Now, Eilert Holton Mom, who was the owner of the estate, he had 12 children, 11 boys and 1 girl. And this particular girl was called Helene Katrine Holton Mom. And in the family book of Holton Mom, she is described as an example of how you develop when you grow up without any female influence and surrounded only by men. Even physically, they said she had been so influenced by her upbringing that she was more of a man than she was of a woman. So to try to do something about this, when she was quite young, she was sent to 2 old, very religious, unmarried aunts who live in the family house here in Trondheim on the corner over here, where she had to spend 3 years embroidering and learning the ways of a proper lady. And she was close to being insane, so in the end, and this is described in the family book, she fled from her aunts and went back to Ørlandet, where her best friend was living. And her best friend was one of the tenant farmers, the daughter of one of the tenant farmers. And the family book also states that after she came back, these 2 declared sacred that they would never marry a man, and that they would live together for all their lives. And the daughter of the estate owner moved in to the daughter of the tenant farmer, and they lived together there for almost 30 years. But what happens is that this daughter of the tenant farmer broke her promise and married a man, and just about managed to get 1 child before she was too old to do it. And she's actually my great-great-great-grandmother. Because we had a family story that said that the most famous owner of the manor of Østerholt was called Lady Inger. She was the owner in the beginning of the 1500s. Henrik Ibsen has written a play about her. She's a big historical character. Now, our family story is that one of our ancestors was the best friend of Lady Inger, and that they two had promised each other never to marry a man, but then my great-great-great-grandmother broke that vow. And I think that it's just the story of these 2 women that has kind of been lifted up to a higher altitude. And that's more or less the only source we have, at least from the 18th or 19th century, of someone who, I mean, it's said with so many words without actually saying it, a lesbian at the time. What we know is that Lady Holton Mom, she lived in the manor for the rest of her life after her best friend had married, and she was a bit of a huge humoristic character. They have a big collection of dirty poetry that she had written in the early 19th century, and she died lonely but loved by her family. That's just how her fate is described. So the next stop we're going to stay in the 18th century now before we move back to organization history. We're going to go just 1 block down, and we're going to present a story from the same time, which has a happy ending, actually, not a bad ending, but in this case about men. Okay, we're going to stay in the 18th, early 19th century. This house used to be one of several houses owned by a rich merchant family in Trondheim called Knutson. Now, the first of this family came to Trondheim in the end of the 18th century, as many people who were merchants in the city had done. He came from the city of Flensburg in today northern Germany, and he settled here and built up a fortune. I think I have to mention how, because it's not very nice. He built up most of his fortune by speculating on the price of grain during the famine in between 1807 and 1813 during the Napoleonic Wars. So he was one of the swines of the time who really profited on the fact that people were starving to death everywhere in also in the streets of this city. But he had a lot of sons, and none of these sons was really very interested in business. And one in particular kind of points out as being, well, not just one, actually several of them, but one had his main interest, you could say, in art. And that was the son called Jørgen von Cappelen Knutsson. Now, already when he was quite young, he found an interest for porcelain, so he managed to convince his father to get the sailors on the ships that they sent to China to handpick specific types of porcelain for their collection. Then he was like in his around 14, 15 or something. And then he wanted to travel for himself. So when he was 17, he boarded one of his father's ships that was heading for the West Indies, where his very sympathetic father, of course, also was a big shareholder in the slave plantations of Danish West India. So he there's nothing sympathetic to say about this person. So Jørgen was going to the West Indies to see the world. That was his intention. But then the boat shipwrecked in the North Sea. Luckily, this was in the summer, because Jørgen was drifting around in the ocean on pieces of wreckage and was really going towards his certain death. But then a British frigate who had just set out from one of the ports of northern Scotland saw him, and he was dragged up from the ocean and from certain death by a 2.10 m tall, noble Scottish officer called Alexander Bailey, and from that moment on, these two men never left each other. Now, Alexander Bailey was from a wealthy noble family in Scotland. Jørgen was from a wealthy, you can say, bourgeois family here in Trondheim. They had a lot of money. They had older brothers, so they didn't have to have a main focus on taking over the business of any sort. They could live on the interest rates of, you can say, the family fortune. And that was what they did. They bought, a little later in life, a villa in Naples. They bought an apartment in Rome and an apartment in Paris, and they traveled between their different addresses and this house and the summer house of the family just north of Bakklandet, and of course the castle of the family of Alexander Bailey in Scotland, and of course also one apartment in London. Now, maybe their greatest achievement was to save the reputation and the art collection of the biggest neoclassicist sculpture of the early 19th century, the Dane Bertel Thorvaldsen, who had really stranded in Rome. He was in a big crisis when Alexander and Jørgen came into his life, because he had gotten payment in advance for a huge burial monument for one of the popes that was supposed to be erected in the Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican, and he had spent all the money and hadn't started at all with this. He was in deep debt, deep personal crisis, was drinking too much, wasn't doing anything what he was done, and these two men kind of laid their wings around him, funded him, you could say, up back on his feet, managed to get him to finish the big funeral monument. And then comes the biggest achievement. Jørgen traveled up to Denmark. Now, this was after 1814, but you know, the contacts between the cultural elite of Norway and Denmark it wasn't broken completely just because we had been handed over to the Swedes as war booty. I mean, people still knew each other, right? The networks were still there. So what Jørgen does is that he manages to convince King Frederick VI to buy the entire sculpture collection of Bertel Thorvaldsen, which at the time was scattered around different storehouses in Rome, bring it all to Denmark and erect a new museum close to the Royal Palace of Copenhagen for the biggest sculptor in Europe at the time, the national hero and Dane Bertel Thorvaldsen. So Jørgen arranged all this, managed to convince the king, and this the end product of this is a big, like, historic piece in you can say Danish national history. The scene when Bertel Thorvaldsen returns to Copenhagen from Rome. It's big national romantic paintings that was made of this when he enters Danish soil once again, and when you can see all his great statues are being loaded off the ships and into the newly erected museum by the palace. That museum can be visited still today, Thorvaldsen's museum in Copenhagen, in the same building that was built for this purpose after the initiative of Jørgen. So that is one big achievement, you could say. Now, the last documentation of these two together is one of the earliest portrait photos that are taken in Denmark, at least. It is taken in the studio of Bertel Thorvaldsen in Copenhagen, and it shows two elderly men sitting in a chaiselong, kind of slightly leaning towards each other, a quite little Norwegian with big curly hair and a big Scotsman sitting next to him. That's Jørgen and Alexander in their old age visiting Bertel Thorvaldsen in Copenhagen. Some years after this, while they were on a stay in Paris, Jørgen caught typhoid fever and died. And he's buried, I never remember the name of this particular, he's not buried in Père Lachaise, he's buried in the cemetery of Montmartre. And still, and I think this has to be some kind of Norwegian gay diaspora group in Paris, someone is not just mending this funeral monument in this particular site in Montmartre in Paris, but someone is also putting pink carnations and gay flags on it. I've seen it twice when I've been there, and I've kind of wondered, I didn't do that. So, so someone clearly has him as a little icon in Paris, which is funny, really. What happened to Alexander afterwards, I actually don't know. But if you go to the university library in Karlskinna and you ask to see the Knutsson room, which is the book collection of the family, and some of the art, you can go in there and stand face to face with both Jørgen and Alexander, carved in as marble busts by Bertel Thorvaldsen. They are still standing there, a bit hidden away from the public eye, but still can be met if people want to meet them. Then we'll go back to organization history and we'll head for 1970. Come closer, please. We have to compete with some noise. You know what? We look at that staircase just for 2 seconds and we'll just go around the corner to kind of avoid a little of the noise. So it's down here. In 1970, and we're not quite sure of the length of it, either it was 6 months or it was a little more, the organization that had been re-established in Trondheim for the first time since the little short period between 1949 and 50, rented the cellars here, the vault cellars here, as their first, you can say, safe house place to socialize, etc. Now, an interesting thing, when the organization in 1949 rented rooms in the Sailors Hotel, they did that in the official name of the organization, and it was no secret what they were doing. In 1970, now this is 2 years before decriminalization, right? They rented this cellar under the name of the organization called Organisasjonen for by og bygd. How do you translate that to English? The organization for city and rural country or something like that, which was the cover name of the Norske Forbund of 1948 or the Norwegian Society of 1948. So they were not at all open with what they were doing. And what also happened here was that after a short period of time they were kicked out because the janitor who kind of managed this thing showed up during an evening and realized what was going on down there, and the day after their contract was terminated and they were not allowed to return. And once again, we have a couple of people who had attended this in 1970. Do you have any memories, any recollection of?
I was not there on the evening.
No.
It is a very nice area down there, and I remember.
Vaulted cellar.
Vaulted cellar, yes, it's really beautiful.
Super place for a club.
Yeah. But, and it was, of course, exciting to just. It was sort of discreet down this little staircase to rush down there and get away from the.
But isn't that part of the story? That staircase did not exist.
Oh yeah.
As far as I remember, the excuse for chopping them out was the fire escape, and that staircase was established much later.
Okay.
I know. We'll have to look into it.
Yeah.
I think.
Okay.
That was the entrance.
We'll continue in time. We're going to move now from 1972 and up to 1979. So we're going to go to Søndregate. So please follow me. So just to recapitulate a little bit of, you can say, the development that we have spoken about now. We have been speaking of safe houses in the 30s, 40s and 50s and 60s. The organization is re-established in 1970, moves into a location which we've just been under a cover name, is kicked out officially because of fire regulative reasons, but in reality because they discovered what they were, right? And then 1973 we've been by the Sailors Hotel Neptune and spoken of thing all of a sudden being legal, but still you had to go past, as one of you mentioned, you had to go past the reception to get in, and a lot of people was afraid to do that because you had to kind of show yourself to be able to enter this place, right? But still, things was legal. And then things kind of went on there for several years, and this is what I've been told. So once again, I would love to get some extra stories by this. But in 1979, things kind of changed because then the organization starts to rent rooms in the student society, Studentersamfunnet. And the parties that they start to have there are not placed on dates when there's no other people there. It's placed on regular Saturdays where it's packed of students in other parts of the building. And all of a sudden, it's not that strange to mix. It's not that strange to go from the one section to the other section. And this is what I've been told as was kind of the biggest step when it comes to actually starting to be a bit open.
But still, you had to say in the door where you were going to. And that's the thing that happened in the hotel. You had to say, "Jag ska på DNF:en." And that's what you had to say at the doorman at the Studentsamfundet as well.
Yeah. So it was still.
Yeah. If you weren't a student, because then you could get in on your student card, of course.
Yeah.
But it's a bit better, yes. Yeah. But I think you can end up then a third step when talking about this house.
Yeah. Because 1979 and up to 1981, it was still more, you can say, a sociable thing. But then comes 1981, and the society, the organization, they rent the second floor up here. And they don't just rent the second floor up here for having a place to have social events. They actually have an office for the organization. They had an illegal bar on Saturdays. That was kind of the official thing. But they have offices for political work. A radio is attemptably established up here, which lasted for some years, wasn't? A local queer radio. So you have kind of changed from secret locations where you have to kind of go through a passage to get in to, you could say, a political center for several activities, not just social events. But still, I mean, this was not an official bar up here. As far as I know, it wasn't legally run.
I drank my beers with a good conscience. I didn't know about that.
But what I've been told about up there was the curtains, which was fantastically deep red velvet curtains that made it possible to close off all view from the street. Looked a bit like a brothel, I've been told, up there. But this is kind of the step further on, right? And later on the same address, you also get the first establishment of Helseutvalget, which started to work with HIV prevention from this. So we are stepping into the modern era. We are stepping into the modern political era, where this is not just legal. Now one is working on the national scale with anti-discrimination laws as well. So, and one is running radios, one is running health work, one is running political work, and of course still doing social events for people so they can feel safe. And then we're going to move on to, I wouldn't say the future, but the nearest history we have. We're going to go to 1988. So in 1988, the organization takes over the rooms behind us here, and this was the gay hangout spot in Trondheim up to 4 years ago or something like that. Is that more or less precise? Yeah. They moved in here with everything. I mean, they moved in here with the radio, Radio Sesam, and they moved in with Helseutvalget and also with the organization. In 1990, the disco, or the cafe, Café Remi, was actually declared the best disco in Norway. So it got a prize for being the best disco in Norway, which, I mean, says a lot about the steps that was taken from just some years before up to a gay disco being given that status. That was 1990. Now in 1992, the Helseutvalget, the health branch of LLH, moved out. The same year the radio was terminated, so you can say that was it wasn't a short-lived affair, but then it stopped. And then we are moving into the interesting thing, which is our own time, because I mean, yes, there is still a gay disco in Trondheim. It's going to be a big party there this evening. But from the end of the 90s and upwards towards our days, it's difficult not to say that many of the functions that was established in the 70s and 80s more or less expired on date, because, well, people started to live so regular lives, things started to be so accepted that a lot of the old supportive functions that was kind of the trademark of the more closed gay community wasn't really something that people demanded anymore. But yet there is still a gay club in Trondheim. It has, as far as I know, never been more than one. So we can't speak of the decay in really big headlines when it comes to the decay of gay culture and on the normalization of everything. So we're kind of still on a float when it comes to this one place. But I don't know what you're going to say. But my experience leading the organization was that there are still groups that really are in need of aid and support and help. But when it comes to the duty of the organization to arrange social arenas for gays and lesbians, it is a demand when it comes to asylum seekers and new countrymen. But when it comes to the majority, my experience at least was that if anybody asked for it, and if you tried to actually do something, nobody really wanted to show up or bothered to show up, because I mean, they had other things to do, they had other places to hang out on. And this was also what happened here in the end of the 90s, Remi, the organization, ran disco that 9 years before had been declared the best disco in Norway. It wasn't shut down, but the organization decided to sell it to some private owners who wanted to run it instead. You can say, and I think more or less at the same time this also happened in Oslo. I don't know when Metropol in Oslo stopped being run by the organization. In the end of the 90s as well? End of the 80s, that early? Okay, yeah. So we were a bit slower here then. Took 10 more years. But that was kind of the end of it. Now I think I'm going to stop there. You have to come and join a new tour the next year, because we have a bit of a medieval history too, but I can't keep this story go on forever, because then you grow bored of me, and we don't want it to end in that way. If you have any questions, I'll just stay here for a little while afterwards so you can ask them. I just want to give a little applause, and I think everybody should join me in that, for the Gay Archive and the work that they're doing in collecting this history. And thank you all for showing up and contributing. Enjoy the Pride, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting.